Hey folks, welcome to Buddhish, our series where we are less formal, less strongly associated with Buddhism, and less censored. So the last time we were doing this, we talked about Buddhist themes in the Matrix. Now, that was fun, but my actual medium of choice is video games. I've loved video games since I was a little kid, still do, and I wanted to talk about a small game with Buddhist themes in it that I think should get more recognition. Today, we are talking about Way of the Passive Fist, developed by Household Games Incorporated. It is up for sale on Steam. I suspect it is on other platforms as well. And it is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as a fighter trained in purely defensive techniques. The only interactions you have in this game are a parry, a dodge, a dash, and a shoulder check, which moves enemies around but doesn't actually hurt them, and a special button that actually is violence. But we'll get into how that's worked into the game as we go on. But basic idea is that your goal as this warrior is to outlast your opponents by defending yourself and letting them gas out. Once they're out of breath, you just push them over. No one is actually hurt in this exchange. So, we just today recorded the episode about Buddhist martial arts, so I wanted to add to it this game about martial arts that has some of the ideas of non-violence that we talked about in this episode baked in. So, let's talk about what we thought of the game first off. So, I played this a long time ago, and beat it, loved it then. And Nick, I believe this is your first time playing this game?
Yeah, it's my first time, and I also really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun, and I thought that the non-violent mechanic created a very interesting dynamic as a player, and it definitely bucked against tropes in other beat 'em up games, specifically the beating up, that made this really interesting. Sort of reversing that violence aspect of the beat 'em up made this kind of an enjoyable, fresh new experience.
Yeah, the actual gameplay is less of a beat 'em up and more of a rhythm game. When you get down to it, each enemy, like when you get into the mechanics, is a set of inputs that you have a specific way you have to negate the damage they're coming in. You have to block every punch. But the mechanics of how you do that is rhythmically hitting the parry, the dodge, and the dash buttons. So, like, this felt a lot more like when I was able to play DDR.
Yeah, exactly. Or, there's even some rhythm input aspects to like AAA games that I remember from being younger, like God of War, for example, and others where, it pops up the button you have to push and you have a specific amount of time. Way of the Passive Fist doesn't pop up the button and tell you what to do, but you do have to learn the rhythm of the enemy you're fighting, and you have to adjust accordingly and input accordingly. And in that way, it does become very rhythmic.
You have to be very patient and disciplined about how you approach the enemies. The intro crawl that introduces the main character, the Wanderer, it mentions that a big part of his martial art is patience, and the game forces the player to have that patience in order to play the game well. You have to let the enemies come to you. You have to watch them and respond to them. You're not actually passive, but you are completely responsive. You don't initiate the conflict until you have meter built up, which is the fist button. I really like the way the game incorporates the Wanderer's fist into his combat style. So, his right hand has been replaced by a mechanical prosthetic. It is oversized, way bigger than his hand should be, way longer. The way he carries it around, it's clearly a lot heavier. So, this fist is a burden for the Wanderer. He hides it. I think he is mildly ashamed of it, and I think it was something imposed on him by the game's ultimate antagonist, Dr. Dyson. at the end of the first chapter, after you beat the thug with a similar mechanical prosthetic, the narration mentions that the doctor must be up to his old tricks, or something along that lines. It seems probable. It's never actually stated outright, but I think the Wanderer was, before this game, experimented on by Dr. Dyson and had his implement of violence attached to him against his will.
Yeah, and that would make sense narratively. I think that is a really plausible interpretation of the narrative.
And this fist is, the mechanical hand is the only offensive actions that the Wanderer has available. He starts with just a simple punch that does damage to one enemy. When you level up, you get access to a throw where he picks the target up, throws them on the ground. That target takes a ton of damage. I think it outright kills non-boss enemies, including the big ones. And it also causes a shockwave that knocks over and slightly damages all enemies on the screen. If you can build up to a 25-hit combo, so you have successfully blocked or dodged 25 hits in a row without messing up, without getting hit, without parrying and missing, because if you parry and don't parry anything, that ends your combo as well. Like, you got to do it perfect, but if you get to that 25-hit combo, you get a screen clear, it kills all bosses, it gives you a ton of points. Congratulations, you have just won. But all of that comes at a cost. You have to build up your meter to use your implement of violence. So, as we've talked about in the episode that would have gone up before this, the violence that the Wanderer himself uses has a cost. And it is very much, in the fiction, it would be the last resort. In the actual gameplay, it is the big reward for being patient and defensive.
It's very interesting to think about it like that, because, like, narratively for me, I was interpreting the fist, the mechanical fist, as being this sort of, like you say, a last resort, and being sort of narratively representative of, like, the moral burden of taking on violence as an option. Because I'm pretty sure, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that you can actually beat the game without ever using the fist.
Unfortunately, no, and there are two reasons for this. In later levels, I think it's chapter 5 or 6, they introduce a robot enemy, and machines don't get tired like biological things do. So its whole gimmick is that you must punch it. There is no way to beat that enemy without using the gauntlet. There is also a boss that does not allow you to get near him. If you get within a certain distance, he just hits you and knocks you away. There is no way to parry or dodge that, and so that means there is no way to wear down his health without using the gauntlet. And in fact, he doesn't let you get close enough to use the punch. You have to use the throw or the bomb. And all of the bosses take like 1,000,000 years to beat without using the fist. The game definitely wants you to use the punch button.
I see, but it sounds like it's much more of a situation like we've been discussing, where it's only as an absolute necessity, and it's sort of trying to reframe your understanding of the violence versus the pacifism of it all by making it so that, you know, you have literally no other choice, as in the case of several of these bosses, and of course with these robot enemies as well, you have to use violence. And in the case of the robot enemies, luckily it's not violence against another living thing.
Right.
It's not violence against a person who, especially if they're a low-level boss, might be able to be, quote-unquote, talked out of it, right? But this is a robot who, you know, you just need to take apart the robot somehow.
The boss fights want you to use the fists. These are the situations where a pacifist would have to set aside and go, no, violence is necessary here. And all of the bosses announce loudly at the start of the fight why it's okay to punch them. Like, your first boss is a stupid brute who looks at a book, throws it away, and shouts, "No more books!" And so, like,
I remember him.
I'm gonna punch that guy. It's okay to punch that guy. He's an asshole. And I think that's what the game is trying to get you to do. And that's also why they all announce, like, I am evil, punch me please, at the start of the fight.
Right, yeah, and that would make sense for it being sort of like a last resort, but a necessary one, right? Because all of the little minor enemies, you don't need to use the fist, but for this boss, it's like, this has turned into a situation that's untenable by, passive fist / nonviolent means, and now something has to be done, which does technically count as violence, but is justifiable given the situation that you find yourself in with this person, because they're so evil, or they're so morally reprehensible, or they're so, of bad character that there's no other way to get around. Their very presence, their very existence, their very continued action is a moral transgression in itself, making it then a moral transgression to allow that to continue when you have the means to stop it.
Exactly. Each of the bosses kind of represent a different type of totally horrible person. We've got the thug, who is just stupid and violent. He just wants to punch things. He doesn't want people reading. He just sucks. The next boss we get is the sun cultist, who is a cultist who wants to worship this planet's baking sun. Like, he is visibly burned to a crisp in his sprite. He's bright red. He's talking about people who hide from this way too close to the planet's sun as being weak. He's such a fanatic that you can't get through to him. So what else are you going to do? You've got to punch him. And so in that way, this game isn't very Buddhist, but as I mentioned in the episode, in this world, there are situations where, like, there's not a peaceful solution. It does not exist.
Yeah, well, and you say it's not very Buddhist, and doctrinally that's true, but, we were talking in the last episode about the soldier monks, and the whole time you were describing that sort of moral calculus and describing these people as people whom you just simply cannot get through to convince them that they're wrong. True or not, I think that soldier monks often viewed their enemies in that way, because they were like, this person thinks they have it all right, but it's my camp, my community, my group, my tribe that has it all right. And it could refer to something political or something doctrinal or something, at the whims of those in power, right? But at the end of the day, they probably also sort of, either before, during, or after the fact, sort of decided these people simply cannot be gotten through to, and so we're only doing this because we absolutely have to.
And sometimes that's true. That's the part that's hard to grapple with. A lot of times it's not. It is usually a matter of violent people finding a way to justify their violence. But also, look at the world right now. Like, there's not always a peaceful solution. And I really like that this game understands that and allows that to be part of its narrative. And I like the way it makes it part of the narrative because, again, that fist is a burden.
Yeah, and, I mentioned Tai Chi and Aikido in the last episode, and I think that these are places where those leave a little bit to be desired, because if you're doing those martial arts the way that they are intended to be done, and with the goal and the core principles of them in mind, then in these sorts of situations, you're basically just defending, throwing, pinning down, restraining ad infinitum, right? And that's not really feasible either. There are points where, like, even in Aikido, it's sort of regarded as like, you should even only use Aikido as a last resort. And Aikido doesn't result in any bone breakages or bruises or anything like that if you're doing it right. The most that somebody has to put up with is like a really mild stretch, like a mild stretch in the shoulder or in the leg or something like that. Obviously, if you get thrown, then you could get a bruise that way. But, when we train, we're training so that you can fall and roll safely. And it's like, even then, you've done all this moral calculus, and now this is the most last resort thing to do. And I think that, I don't want to say that it doesn't go far enough, because like I think of myself as a pacifist for the vast majority of the time as well. But I do think that, like, for example, against somebody with a gun, Aikido, Tai Chi, they don't work. No martial art really works if the person has the intention to shoot you with a gun in hand. And so, yeah, this brings in this idea that, you know, you have to rethink sort of the morality of what you're doing, not in terms of like, oh, my own actions are so reprehensible because I did violence to somebody. You have to rethink it, like I stated before, where it's like, it's reprehensible to let this happen without stopping it. It's reprehensible to not change the state of affairs as they are.
But also, sometimes there are hazards in the background besides the enemies you're fighting. In level 2, there are sections where there's an artillery gun firing at you as you are deflecting people who are coming up to fight you fist to fist. The artillery will hit your enemies and it will damage them, but it doesn't damage them very much, and it knocks them to the ground and they take a while to get back up. To do levels as quickly as possible and get the highest possible score in those areas, not only do you have to dodge the artillery shells, you have to use the shoulder check to knock enemies out of the way. Because if you knock them out of the way and then deflect their attacks, you will clear the encounter much faster than if you let the artillery hit the enemy and they get knocked over.
Right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
The developers of this game really keyed into what makes it fun to play defense in a video game. And they've incorporated one tool for each type of defense. There's the parry, there's the dash for getting out of the way, there's the shoulder check for stunning enemies and moving enemies, and then there's the dodge for a high commitment but high effectiveness way of dodging things that are otherwise unparryable. Like, those are the 4 most basic ways in an action game to defend yourself. And this whole game is about, okay, we've got these 4 tools, let's make the player use these tools in a very specific pacifist way. Like, everything about the way the game flows is corralling the player into playing the way the wanderer would fight.
I think it's an excellent sort of blend of mechanics and narrative that you rarely see in games. I mean, it's unfortunate that it's this way, but truly I think that like they narratively and thematically justify all elements of the gameplay mechanics, and then those gameplay mechanics function the other direction and then support and flesh out those narrative elements and thematic elements of the character himself. Like, I think that it's a very positive and unique synergy that occurs between the two, and I love to see that in games. I think that both aspects of a game need to be designed with the other in mind and with the potential for synergy in mind between the two. You know, like it's not as good to have a game that's got a wonderful story, but you hate sitting down to play it because you hate trying to move your character. You hate trying to do something with your character.
There are so many good stories that I have bounced off of because of exactly that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a shame because the stories could be so good and so rewarding, but it's almost like a barrier. It's hostile to the player in some ways. And then the other works as well, where it's like, yeah, this game has like really fun inputs, but I don't play games because I get joy out of sitting down and pushing buttons in a certain sequence. I play games because I want some sort of reward for doing that. I want some sort of reward narratively, visually, mechanically, something for playing the game. And this one was a game that's rewarding in both ways, and I appreciated that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of game design reinforcing narrative, then narrative reinforcing game design, like, that is why game design is such a difficult field, because figuring that out, setting those structures up, is really difficult, and altering either one of those structures, even slightly, can cause changes that have to go through to the other end. We're talking about this game's narrative, and it's actually, there's almost no writing.
Yes.
The actual script of this game is like 2 pages long. But what writing is there is extremely efficient, and it's reinforced by the game's art style. This game takes place on Zircon 5, a planet that is way too close to its parent star to actually support human civilization. But there's resources there, so some people are trying to do it anyway. And everything about the way the game looks and sounds follows from that idea, and the little bit of writing, just that tiny bit, does a whole lot to flesh out the art that we're seeing, and it does a lot to flesh out the way the Wanderer operates. So it's not much writing, but it's super efficient writing.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and a light touch is especially good whenever you have compelling characters like the Wanderer himself. You know, all you have to say is sort of, you know, he has returned from exile, and the player, they're going to start filling in all this extra stuff, and they're going to be compelled by the fact that, like, we don't actually know everything about this person, and the game or the story is not telling us as though we're children, right? I think that whenever you are doing narrative stuff, it is critically important to trust your consumer to do some work for you. As in, you know, don't overwrite, don't over-explain, don't overtell, and sometimes use a light touch with showing, right? They always say show, don't tell, but even using an incredibly light touch with showing instead of telling, that can also work wonders. It can, you know, you give them an inch and they will take a mile in some cases if it's done effectively. You know, you start with a compelling character and a compelling premise, and it's like half the battle. You don't have to do much else past that. You've already sort of gotten people on board.
Yeah, exactly. You're talking about people with the media, you give them an inch and they take a mile. Like, that's what efficient writing is.
Right.
It's 2 sentences that implies 20 years of backstory. There are ways to do that, and the writing in this game is arch, and like it's tropey, and it's not really why we're here, but it is exactly what it needs to be. That little bit of writing gives us a whole lot of world.
Yeah, and it does, like we've said, functions to support the mechanics of the game and why you are playing the Wanderer the way that you are.
So, I do want to get to some criticisms of the game, because it's not perfect. So, one thing I will say immediately, this game has huge, gorgeous sprites. The artwork here is top-notch. These things animate very well. However, because these sprites are so big and so detailed, the rest of the game feels like it needs to be a little slower than I like in order to compensate for how much of the screen these sprites take up. These sprites are so big that it's very easy to knock enemies off the screen, and that's a long-standing annoyance with these kinds of side-scrolling beat-em-ups of enemies being off-screen when they act on you. The way this game compensates for that is by having off-screen enemies just make big, ridiculous jumps into the center of the screen. And also, the way enemies move around, and like even the Wanderer moves around, feels really sluggish to me. And I think that's because they want to make these big, detailed sprites. They want you to have enough time to look at them. And I think I would honestly prefer a style that had smaller sprites, but those characters involved moved faster. Everything in this game feels sluggish.
I agree. I had that exact same experience, and it was actually like a curve for me to sort of account for the sluggishness to be able to respond to the stimuli that the game was giving me. And I agree completely about the off-screen thing. And, you know, this is a small thing, but most side-scrollers that I have grown up with and played when I was younger, you could only kick enemies off-screen in one direction. But in this one, you can do it in both. And that's also just a minor annoyance for me. I think it would help the game somewhat if there was like a hard wall to the left, and then you could kick people out to the right. I understand the game wants to make it so that you're fighting in 2 directions, and you have to sort of adjust accordingly whenever there's mobs of small level enemies coming at you.
The game wants the Wanderer to feel like he is surrounded all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I agree. Like, the field of view should be bigger at the very least.
And I would also like a more responsive dash. The dash in this game is weird in that, like, so this is a game where you can move left, right, up, and down. The dash is always going to move left or right. You can angle it to go up or down at the same time, but there's no way to just dash upward. And it feels like the Wanderer should have that kind of sidestep. And also there are a lot of threats in the game that feel like they should be defeated by that kind of sidestep. And it's not there.
And so we're not talking about a jump as much as moving from the player's point of view further into the arena or closer to you in the arena, right? So, we're all still on the x-axis, so to speak. We're not like jump up in the air because that's not really super necessary.
You could do jumps could be part of a defense-focused game. That could be a way to get around certain projectiles, but that's not what's going on here. We're just talking about moving closer or further from the screen, like you do with the dash. It's always going to send you forward as well, and there's just a lot of times that I dodged into damage because I was trying to sidestep.
Yeah, and it feels like there should be a little bit more freedom.
Like, the way the controls work, it feels in my hands like that's what should happen. And that's why I keep doing it, because it feels correct that if I hit the up button and dash, I am going to go up. Instead, I go up and forward. It's just really annoying, especially in fights where there are stage hazards.
Along that same train of thought, I also thought that it might be cool to borrow from like fighting games and have a mechanic where you can dodge through an attack. So if somebody's attacking you from right to left, when the attack is supposed to hit, you hit dodge. And now instead of being on the left side of the screen and the opponent on the right, you've switched. And now they have to sort of change direction, and now you do as well. I thought that would be a cool thing, because that switching of position is something that you see all the time in real life nonviolent martial arts, and even violent ones as well. And its purpose is sort of what it says on the tin, right? It's essentially to buy some time for you to think, for you to avoid getting hit, and to also break up the rhythm of the attacker who is expecting a hit, but then they get dead air. And you're also sort of startling them by going towards them and going inside of their range while they're attacking. You sort of like give them a jump, right? Give them a little scare.
It's a surprise.
Yeah, and that breaks their concentration and their rhythm. And now you have the advantage, right? That's something that I was taught to do a lot. That's something that I see all the time. And I think it would be cool for the game to borrow that as well.
Yeah, in fighting games, that is called a cross-up, and it is a very effective tactic. You have to know in high-level fighting games which characters have cross-ups, and be ready to respond to that before you fight them. So, yeah, cross-ups are a thing that's all over the place in games, it's all over the place in martial arts media. There is room for it in this game, I think, but the developers wanted to keep it simple and accessible in a way that I super respect.
Yeah.
You could have, say, a different effect when you... Right now, the dodge button is just you dodge out of the way and then step back to where you were. And it's like that no matter what direction you're pushing when you hit the dodge button. Up dodge could be a different input. The cross-up dodge that you're talking about could be forward and dodge button. And there are so many ways you could make that into a game mechanic. Like, I would love to see a way of the passive fist 2 that actually adds more complex means of defense. Like, you only have a parry button. There's no difference between a down parry, up parry, forward parry. You could put tilts into this kind of system. I'm not sure if that would make way of the passive fist better, because it's going for its own thing. But I also do think that, like, there were several spots, especially in boss battles, where I felt like I did not have the tool I needed to get through. And that's what we're actually talking about here, is that the kit feels like it has a few holes.
Right. And like we say, part of it is due to this simplicity that we're talking about, where the developers are like, I want one button to do one thing, and give it, like, a very classic arcade feel, right? Where combinations of directions and buttons, it's not going to make a difference, or that huge of a difference at least. But yeah, A Way of the Pacifist 2 that could sort of close those gaps where you're fighting an enemy and you don't want to try over again to get a 25 hit combo so that you can finally build up enough meter to actually do something about whatever they're doing to you, right? It's way better, way more effective to include a mechanic that, yes, does complicate the controls, but then does give the player another tool with which to sort of be creative and get around the problem in front of them.
Next big criticism I'm going to give, and I hope we're not being annoying about this kind of thing on this show, but it keeps coming up. This game is not very good about representing women. So the only women in this game are also the only humans who use ranged weapons. There are no melee women, and it's a trope that I really would rather see go away. You know, a lady who throws a knife is a cool enemy. I totally want her to be in there. But also, this is a setting with kind of a Mad Max influence, and I wish there was a enemy type that was a woman in Mad Max gear coming into melee and being a threat beyond having something to throw at you. All of the women in this game are just throwing things at you.
Yeah, well, and in having this failure to represent women very effectively, that makes it very similar to Buddhism, right? Because
right,
exactly, there's the gender problem there. And I don't think we're being annoying by saying so. I think that it's important when your setting does not impose any sort of rule that you have to be accurate to something in history in real life that sexism exists in, right? If you're transporting a European medieval setting to your game, your story, your whatever, then yeah, you do sort of almost necessarily inherit some stuff with that, including the sexism, wherein it's like, it's a very decisive narrative move to not have sexism, to not have something like that. In a, distant future setting where you've colonized a planet far away, that there's no need for there to be a lack of representation. It makes perfect sense for 50% of the enemies to be women and 50% to be men, and for the women to be able to do just as much complicated shit as all of the guys can do.
But don't get me wrong, the cultist women, they have some interesting attack patterns. The other throwing enemies just throw one projectile at you, and you can defeat all of them, literally all of them, by just catching and throwing that projectile back. The sun cultist women throw multiple projectiles, and you can catch and throw back the first one that they throw at you, but if you do, the second one is going to hit you.
Right, yeah, and that's an interesting sort of move.
Right, that enemy type is excellent. I really liked fighting her. It's just one more enemy type, maybe even just one more boss that was a lady, would completely remove this criticism, and that doesn't feel like a lot of work to do. It's not enough for me to lower my praise of the game, but we do need to point it out when this kind of problem comes up.
Yeah, we absolutely do.
And the last complaint I'm going to register, so when I first played this years ago, I played it on normal difficulty and beat the whole game. When I came back to play it for this show, I saw that they had added a New Dawn mode. It's basically a hard mode that remixes enemies into a super hard thing where you actually have a limited amount of lives. In the main story, you can restart as many times as you want. In New Dawn mode, you have 5 lives, and if they're gone, you have to start all the way over. And I was actually having a really good time with it as I started it, because, it's the same old sprites, but the enemy patterns get remixed. Like, the first time I saw the big burly dude who tries to throw you in the main game, they had remixed him such that he was all strikes. He didn't actually try to throw me. And the first time I saw that attack pattern, I got thrown off real bad because I was expecting to throw. And the New Dawn mode does several similar things like that. But the first boss really annoyed me. This boss is one where just getting a certain distance close to him, he hits you. Just period. That's it. And I needed either that sidestep we were talking about, a way to affect enemies from a high distance, or a clear delineation, a marker on the ground that let me know what the boss's range was. Because between juggling 4 mook enemies that I'm mostly using trying to build meter so I can do something that affects this boss, it's too much. There's 4 mooks, there's the boss. I can't tell where the boss's attack range is all the time. And it was just too much. It was really frustrating. It was a wall that I did not feel like going through. That boss was just very frustrating in an unfun way.
Yeah, it's definitely not a skill issue. It's definitely a situation where they have put sort of an untenable challenge in front of you, and there's no good reason for it, you know?
I mean, there is a skill issue involved. People have completed this mode. It's not like it's impossible. There are people who are good enough at it to do that. But especially considering the relative lack of difficulty of the stage leading up to it, like, I took a couple hits, but I did not lose any lives until I got to the boss. It was a difficulty spike that I found really frustrating, and that has dissuaded me from continuing to play the new stuff. That said, the rest of the game is super fun. Like, I've enjoyed my time with this thoroughly. Did you have any criticisms you wanted to lay out that I didn't?
No, I share all your criticisms. I think that it needs a new sidestep, and I think that it could have on a sequel, you know, a step through or a cross up. But yeah, I feel the same about the parts that I played that you mentioned.
All right. Is there any, I think I've said what I wanted to say. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that takes care of it for me.
Well, I think that means we are done then. So thanks for listening to us to our first video game analysis. I am a huge game design nerd. I love getting into the details of what makes a good game good, what makes a bad game bad, and I don't get a lot of opportunity to do that. So this has been fun. We're definitely going to do more of this kind of thing in the future, but anyway, for now, that was Way of the Passive Fist by Household Games.
Thanks for listening, and I hope that we get to do way more of these sort of non-violent or these Buddhist-inflected or Buddhist-influenced games, either, you know, influenced narratively or mechanically. I love playing games, and I love learning about games, and so this was a great opportunity to do that, where, you know, usually I'm used to doing movies, books, doctrinal texts, commentaries, whatever. This was a nice way to stretch my legs into something that I haven't really talked about on a podcast before. And so I'm hoping we can do it again, and I enjoyed it very much. Hope you did as well. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If this conversation made the game sound interesting, go get it on Steam or any of the major consoles. It's great, and it's not that expensive, and it's often on sale, so go for it. Alright, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.